In the early 1990s, the collapse of the Soviet Union was not a slow fade into history. It was an economic implosion that hit like a shockwave. One day the USSR existed, at least on paper, and the next day it was a broken structure full of unpaid workers, abandoned assets, and officials who did not even know who they were supposed to report to anymore. The world tends to talk about the fall of the Soviet Empire in terms of politics or ideology, but on the ground, for the people living through it, the collapse was painfully physical. Entire naval fleets that once symbolized Soviet strength were suddenly sitting idle, rusting at their moorings, with no fuel, no mission, and no funding. What had been one of the most formidable military forces on the planet became a collection of stranded vessels and forgotten men almost overnight. Walk through a Soviet harbor in 1992, and you would not see a navy preparing for a new global conflict. You would see a navy struggling to survive. Ships that once sailed across entire oceans now sat motionless, half-manned by sailors who had not been paid in months. Officers who once held serious authority found themselves powerless, some even selling their own uniforms just to buy bread. These harbors were not military bases anymore. They were graveyards of steel, hope, and a vanished ideology. The quiet was striking. Where there had once been the constant rhythm of engines, drills, and orders being shouted across decks, there's only the sound of water hitting metal, and the shuffle of men who no longer knew what future they were serving. The state itself was drowning in debt, and it did not have a plan to save the Navy or anything else. The government's desperation for cash forced it into decisions that would have been unthinkable only a year earlier. To keep basic functions running, officials were told, unofficially, and sometimes even directly, to sell assets. And when a government collapses, assets can mean almost anything: buildings, vehicles, aircraft, even warships. Items that had been protected secrets for decades suddenly became things you could put a price tag on. In many regions, the central government's authority evaporated entirely. Local officials who had little oversight and even less guidance began selling whatever they controlled. The Soviet Navy, scattered across ports in Russia, Ukraine, and other republics, quickly became a series of independent fiefdoms, each run by people who were terrified, broke, and desperate. This meant that the sixth largest navy in the world, with hundreds of ships ranging from submarines to destroyers, was effectively ownerless and directionless. Imagine parking your car at a mall, going inside, and returning to find that the mall no longer exists, the police department is broke, and someone is offering to sell your car to you for scrap metal. That absurd scenario is exactly what the Soviet Navy looked like in the early 1990s. Everything was technically still there, but no one knew who had authority, who could prevent a sale, or who was responsible for maintaining anything. Some ships had crews still on board, clinging to their routines because they did not know what else to do. Others had been completely abandoned, left to rust in the cold air because there was no money for maintenance. Fuel was so scarce that many ships could not even start their engines. Some vessels were used as floating dormitories simply because sailors had nowhere else to live. The military infrastructure that once supported them, supply chains, repair facilities, logistic centers, had collapsed alongside the government. Without fuel, ammunition, salaries, or even clear instructions, these ships were no longer strategic assets. They were burdens. They were liabilities. They were giant pieces of metal that cost money every single day to keep afloat. And when something costs money you do not have, the quickest solution is to get rid of it. That is how the unthinkable became the practical. Officials began selling ships. Not ex-military vessels cleaned up for civilian buyers. Not carefully decommissioned hardware passed on to friendly nations. No, entire warships sold as raw scrap. Huge destroyers priced by the ton, not by their military history. Submarines sold for the value of their metal hulls, not their place in strategic doctrine. It was a clearance sale born from pure desperation. And because there was no consistent oversight, every region had different rules and different prices. In some places, the price was whatever a buyer could pay in cash that day. In others, the negotiations were so chaotic that buyers could walk away with deals that made no rational sense at all. This was the world Dew stepped into. A world where structures that once seemed immovable were collapsing so quickly that almost anything was possible. Ships that had taken millions to build and decades to maintain were now being sold off without ceremony. No one had a plan. No one had control. And no one suspected that, in the middle of all this, a single man could walk into the chaos and walk out owning pieces of what had once been the pride of a superpower. Dew was not the kind of man anyone expected to show up in the middle of a collapsing superpower. He was not a billionaire tycoon with political connections, he was not a shadowy arms dealer, and he definitely was not a Bond villain shopping for submarines. Du was at his core a practical businessman. He understood markets, he understood timing, and most importantly, he understood chaos in a way that many bureaucrats living through the collapse did not. While officials panicked about budgets and political survival, Du looked at the same mess and saw potential. He saw value where everyone else saw rust, waste, and headaches. In moments of historical breakdown, the people who thrive are often not the most powerful, but the ones who can recognize an opportunity before everyone else realizes one exists. After the fall of the Soviet Union, the newly independent states became flooded with all sorts of Western entrepreneurs. Some were legitimate investors hoping to build new businesses. Others were opportunists who saw a chance to buy assets for pennies on the dollar. The post-Soviet world was a giant marketplace overnight, and no one was really controlling who came in, what they bought, or how much they paid. In that chaotic environment, Du arrived at exactly the right moment, when confusion was at its absolute peak and oversight was at its absolute lowest. You could almost say he stepped onto the stage at the exact second when history paused and asked, "Anyone want any of this?" Du did not come looking for glory. He was not chasing prestige. He was trying to buy scrap metal, machinery, equipment, anything he could flip for a profit. Scrap was the gold rush of the decade. Factories, warehouses, entire fleets of old vehicles were being sold off at ridiculous prices. And in this frenzy, Du discovered something almost unbelievable. Soviet naval ships were also being listed as assets. Not warships, not military technology, just assets, big, heavy, metallic assets that could be valued by weight rather than purpose. When officials had no fuel for ships, no salaries for sailors, and no faith in the old system, they started viewing their hardware the same way a scrapyard owner would. It did not matter what the ship used to be. What mattered was how much steel was inside it. Du understood instantly what that meant for someone like him. A ship that cost millions to build could be bought for a fraction of that price, simply because its value was reduced to raw material. Prices were so low that they seemed like typos, dollars per ton, instead of real market valuations. But they were not typos. They were survival tactics. Bureaucrats needed cash immediately. Some needed it to keep the lights on in their offices. Others needed it to pay local workers who had gone months without salaries. And some simply wanted to pocket whatever they could before a higher authority returned to check their paperwork. For a buyer with cash in hand, negotiations were shockingly simple. If you showed up, paid on the spot, and did not ask too many questions, you could walk away with almost anything. Imagine Du walking through cold, quiet shipyards with a translator beside him. Around him stand massive hulls that once patrolled foreign waters, now chained to docks like forgotten relics. Soviet officers, still wearing faded uniforms, shrug at questions. You want it? Pay today. Paperwork that should take months is scribbled together in minutes. Entire ledgers are handwritten on the spot. Each conversation feels like it could fall apart at any moment, but also like it could transform into a deal worth more than Du had ever imagined. It was not glamorous, it was surreal. Bureaucratic chaos had turned into a marketplace. Du was not trying to be clever. He was simply paying attention. Officials believed he was buying scrap metal, and to be fair, that is exactly what most of the ships would become once they were dismantled. But in a world where no one seemed to know who officially owned the ships, the person with cash effectively became the person with authority. Du did not have to bend rules or manipulate anyone. The rules were already broken. The system was already fractured. He just walked through the cracks. He did not steal the Soviet Navy. He did not outsmart anyone. He simply read the moment correctly. While everyone around him was frozen by the uncertainty of a collapsing empire, Du moved with confidence. That confidence, combined with timing, opportunity, and a little bit of absurd luck, turned him into the accidental buyer of one of the largest naval fleets on Earth. On the day the deal actually happened, the scene did not look like a high-stakes international negotiation. It looked like a scrapyard that just happened to be full of warships. Du arrived at a harbor lined with dozens of Soviet vessels, the kind of ships he had only ever seen in documentaries: patrol boats, corvettes, tankers, tugboats, and even a few hulking destroyers that still carried the silhouettes of missile launchers. They were silent, inactive, and stripped of fuel, but they still had the unmistakable presence of machines that were never meant to be ordinary merchandise. Some even had their weapons still mounted, rusting but recognizable. It was the kind of place where history felt heavy in the air, like the steel itself remembered what it had once been built to do. The layout was overwhelming. Row after row of ships tied to docks that were falling apart faster than the government that once controlled them. The water was calm, but the energy in the harbor was uneasy, as if everyone there understood that something absurd was unfolding, but no one wanted to say it out loud. Du walked between these massive vessels with a translator beside him, each step echoing off empty metal. Soldiers stood around in faded uniforms, not guarding the ships so much as lingering near them, like they were saying a quiet goodbye. Some smoked in silence, others glanced at Du with a mix of confusion and resignation. They knew what was happening. Their ships were being sold piece by piece, like leftover inventory after a fire sale. The officials running the process were not dignified statesmen. They were stressed, exhausted bureaucrats who were desperate to complete a transaction, any transaction that would bring in cash. They had been given authority with no oversight, responsibility with no structure, and pressure with no guidance. Their solution was simple: treat everything like junkyard scrap. Forget military classifications. Forget sentimental value. Forget that these vessels once patrolled oceans and represented the power of a superpower. The only thing that mattered was weight. Tons. Steel. Raw material. They had scales, calculators, and handwritten ledgers. That was their entire system. When Du was shown the price sheet, he almost laughed. It looked like a joke. Instead of names of ships or classes or capabilities, there were weights. A destroyer listed like an outdated refrigerator. A missile boat priced like a broken car. The officials explained with straight faces that the vessels were being sold based on how many tons of metal they contained, nothing more. Du did the math in his head and realized the unbelievable truth. He was basically buying entire warships for the cost of their scrap value. It was the kind of deal that should not exist in any rational world, but this was not a rational world. This was the Soviet collapse, and in that collapse, the old rules did not matter. At some point during the negotiation, Du had a moment of clarity, so surreal, he almost stopped the meeting. He looked at the list, looked at the ships, looked at the officials rushing him to sign, and thought, wait, am I buying the entire fleet? He asked the translator to confirm. The translator asked the officials. They shrugged. One finally said in the most casual tone imaginable, if you pay for it, you own it. That was it. No speeches. No ceremony. No military protocol. Just a shrug that decided the fate of dozens of vessels. It was not a negotiation. It was triage. They needed money today, and Du had it. That desperation filled the air. Paperwork that should have taken months was thrown together in an afternoon. Stamps, signatures, and photocopies were slapped onto documents that looked more like grocery receipts than international asset transfers. One signature, and Du suddenly owned more naval vessels than most countries. He walked in as a businessman looking for scrap, and walked out as the accidental owner of a chunk of the Soviet Navy. But beneath the absurdity, there was a human weight to the moment. Du felt a jolt of adrenaline, but also a strange sense of guilt. Soldiers who had served on these ships for years stood quietly as the deal wrapped up. Some looked away. Some watched the signing like they were witnessing the end of an era. There was sadness there, a kind of mourning for a world that had vanished faster than anyone expected. These ships had been their homes, their pride, their identity. Now they were paperwork items being traded off to a foreign businessman who did not speak their language. Even Du, who came for business, understood the gravity of what was happening. History was slipping through fingers in real time. An empire's steel legacy was being traded like scrap. And he found himself at the center of a moment that felt both absurd and strangely tragic. It was the day chaos dressed itself as a transaction, and somehow he walked away with the keys. Du woke up the morning after the deal with a strange feeling that he had somehow stepped into a story that was far bigger than anything he had planned. The documents said he was now the owner of several Soviet naval vessels, and the papers looked official enough, stamped with seals and signatures that carried the authority of a state that no longer existed in any stable form. But the reality of what he had taken on did not hit him until he was actually standing on the deck of one of the ships, feeling the metal groan beneath his feet, smelling the oil, rust, and cold that had soaked into every corner of the vessel. He never wanted a navy. He wanted metal, maybe a business opportunity, maybe a way to make quick money in a chaotic time. What he got instead was the ghost of an empire wrapped in steel. He was not trying to build a private fleet. He was not dreaming of flags, admirals, or maritime power. He could not even afford to keep these ships running for a week, let alone maintain or operate them. The engines alone needed more money than he had ever moved in his life. The crews were gone or unpaid. Some ships still had officers who refused to leave because they did not know who to report to anymore. Others sat empty, stripped of anything that could be carried off by sailors, mechanics, or thieves looking for a piece of value in a collapsing world. Due quickly realized that the only logical future for most of these vessels was scrap or resale. They were never going to sail again. News spread faster than he expected. First locally, where officials laughed in disbelief when they realized that a foreign businessman had somehow bought a chunk of what used to be the pride of the Soviet Navy. Then internationally, in small articles and odd headlines that treated the story like a joke. A man had accidentally bought a navy. People chuckled, but behind the humor there was a quiet reflection about how far a superpower had fallen. Journalists called it absurd. Analysts called it symbolic. Sailors who had served on these ships did not call it anything, but their silence said enough. The problems landed on Due faster than he could process them. Some ships had weapons that nobody knew how to categorize. They were inactive, but they were still weapons. Who was responsible for them now? Due asked the same officials who sold him the ships, but they shrugged and told him everything was included in the price. The paperwork was a mess, written half in Russian, half in Soviet-era terminology that nobody in the modern world used anymore. Even identifying the exact status of each vessel was a challenge. Some were missing documents entirely. Others had logs filled out by officers who were long gone. Due found himself dealing with shells of machines that had once been part of a meticulously organized war machine, but now existed in a kind of legal and physical limbo. The emotional weight of everything hit him slowly. At first he saw only numbers, weight calculations, and potential scrap value. But the longer he spent walking through the shipyards, the more he saw the human part of it. Rusted hallways still had signs painted on the walls by sailors who once lived there. Old boots were left under bunks. Photos were taped inside lockers. There was a feeling that people had expected to return, but never did. Due was not a sentimental man, but it is very hard to stand in the ruins of someone else's life and not feel something. Some sailors came back out of curiosity. Others stayed near the docks because they had nowhere else to go. Due watched the way their eyes changed when they looked at the ships. They were not looking at metal. They were looking at memories, sacrifices, and years of loyalty to a state that had vanished in an instant. He saw men touch the hulls gently, as if they were greeting an old friend or saying goodbye. He saw them look at him as if trying to understand how this man, a stranger with a translator, now owned the thing they once dedicated their lives to. He learned very quickly that owning a navy is not powerful. It is exhausting. Every ship is a giant machine that demands money constantly. Even doing nothing costs money. Rust eats everything. Engines decay. Systems collapse. He felt as if he had adopted a herd of enormous, starving animals that were already dying and could not be saved. He did not buy a future. He bought debris from a past that nobody knew how to handle anymore. He inherited the responsibility for machines that represented a century of ambition, fear, pride, and political power, and all he could do was watch them rot faster than he could decide what to do next. In the end, most of the ships went exactly where everyone knew they would go, even if they did not want to say it out loud. They were sold as scrap, cut into pieces in distant yards, disappearing quietly into piles of steel that would eventually become something completely unrelated to the lives they once carried. There were no ceremonies, no flags lowered, no official words spoken. An empire's navy did not end in battle, but in welding torches and shipping invoices. Due walked away with some profit, some loss, and a story that still did not feel real even as he lived it. But the larger truth extended beyond him. It was a reminder of how fast power can collapse, how value can shift overnight, and how timing can turn an ordinary businessman into the owner of a navy he never wanted. The ships may have vanished into scrap, but the lesson stayed sharp. When a system falls apart, the things it once guarded so fiercely become objects in marketplace, waiting for whoever arrives with cash and the willingness to step into history at exactly the wrong or right moment. History does not always end with dramatic finales. Sometimes it ends quietly, in broken offices and forgotten shipyards, where the past is sold off by the ton. Due's story was never really about one man buying a navy. It was about the strange moments when a collapsing world creates bargains that feel more like funerals. Power vacuums create opportunities, but they also leave behind people and memories that never find a buyer. And if this story made you feel the weight of that absurd, fragile moment in history, then let me know in the comments below.